During the London Olympics, a young Puerto Rican boxer, Felix Verdejo Sánchez, emerged as a shining star. Heralded as a diamond, he was seen as one of the most promising athletes from his country, with predictions of future titles and gold medals. Everyone believed that this talented and driven young man would reach incredible heights in the world of sports. In 2021, Felix Verdejo's name resurfaced in the global media, but this time it was in the crime section. The story revolves around a teenage romance that grew into an obsession, ultimately leading to a horrific tragedy. This tale also highlights how the 2014 Knockout of the Year recipient, praised and promoted by two-time Olympic champion Vasyl Lomachenko, narrowly avoided a death sentence and was sentenced to life imprisonment instead. Despite overwhelming evidence and his accomplice's confession, Verdejo continues to deny any guilt. Born on May 19, 1993, in San Juan, Puerto Rico, Felix grew up in a modest, large family and had a passion for sports from an early age. Initially, he planned to pursue a career in baseball, but a pivotal incident changed his path. At 9 years old, after a quarrel and fight with a visiting friend's son, Felix's father suggested he take up boxing if he wanted to fight. Felix fell in love with boxing from his first training session at the local gym. By 16, Felix won the Pan American Junior Championships, followed by his country's championship a year later. In 2012, he reached the quarterfinals at the London Olympics, marking the start of his impressive professional career. Verdejo had 29 fights, securing 27 victories. In 2014, he was credited with the year's best knockout against Sergio Villanueva. A year later, Felix won his first championship belt, the WBO Latino title, which he defended 6 times over 2 years. His skill and talent left no doubt that he was destined for greatness in boxing history. Keishla Rodriguez, born in November 1993 in San Juan, had a similar background. Her full name was Keishla Marlene Rodriguez Ortiz. She grew up in a close-knit family with her parents, Jose and Kayla Rodriguez, her sister, Beralise Nicole, and her half-brother, Jonathan. Keishla was outgoing, excelled in school, and loved animals, aspiring to be a veterinarian. Her sister, Beralise, was her confidant and best friend. Keishla and Felix attended the same school and developed a romantic relationship in their teenage years. When Keishla's parents divorced in 2011, her mother moved to Florida, but Keishla and her sister remained in San Juan, staying closely connected. At 18, the promising boxer Felix, who had already competed in the Olympics, began dating Elisa Maria Santiago Sierra, a young aspiring model. Despite being in a relationship with Elisa, Felix continued seeing his childhood friend Keishla. Keishla's sister and mother knew about the affair and disapproved of it, recognizing the complexity of the situation. Elisa believed she was Felix's one true love and future wife, while Keishla, aware of Felix's engagement, found herself unable to break away from him. Felix's relationships were tumultuous, marked by his rising fame and the constant attention from admirers. Despite his serious relationship with Elisa, he could not let go of Keishla. This love triangle, filled with deception and emotional turmoil, ultimately led to a tragic conclusion. The once promising star of Puerto Rican boxing, who seemed destined for greatness, ended up in the criminal chronicles, his legacy forever marred by the events that unfolded in 2021. On top of that, he was her first great love, and deep down, the naive girl herself still hoped to be the one. In 2016, the boxer did marry the young Eliza, who at that time was barely 19 years old. Eliza by that time was already quite a famous model, had tens of thousands of followers in social networks, and also opened her own beauty studio for eyelash extensions. In August of the same year, just a few months after the wedding, the athlete got into a serious car accident when he was rushing on his motorcycle. He was taken to the hospital in serious condition with head injuries, bruises, and lacerations. His trainer, Ricky Marquez, seriously feared that his talented charge would go off the rails at the height of his career. But Felix, contrary to the disappointing prognosis, made a rapid recovery, and soon returned to the ring. In September 2019, the boxer published in his profile in the social network a picture with Elise, who was in a large term of pregnancy. In the comment to the photo, he wrote, "Soon I will meet my daddy's princess." And a month later, he announced the birth of a daughter, who was given the name Miranda Verdejo Santiago. The young man in public looked like a loving husband, caring father, and an exemplary family man. But secretly from his wife, he continued to meet with Keishla, who could not let go. As Eliza later admitted, she guessed that her husband was cheating on her, but every time he tearfully vowed to leave his mistress. Keishla repeatedly tried to break off this painful relationship, but Felix would not let her go. She had no other men, because the boxer threatened that if he found out about the fact that Keishla had someone, not good for her and her chosen one, Keishla herself, who had fallen in love with Verdejo since high school, continued to love him despite everything. Rodriguez, as planned, connected her life with the care of animals and got a job at the Center of Veterinary Medicine and Aesthetics. Colleagues described her as conscientious, hard-working, and very responsible. She lived with 2 dogs and a cat, which she simply adored. In 2020, Eliza discovered the correspondence of her husband with several mistresses, including Keishla. The wife gave her husband a scandal and threw him out of the house, threatening that she would file for divorce and forbid him to see his daughter. Eliza's threats had an effect. In addition, in the career of the athlete at that time, there was a serious decline and unnecessary problems where he did not need. For a while, he really stopped seeing Rodriguez, but Felix still did not let her go, trying to control almost every step Keishla. After a few months of secret visits resumed, and in April 2021, Keishla discovered that she was pregnant. She bought a rapid test at the drugstore, which only confirmed her fears. She first called her sister, who was aware of her complicated relationship with the athlete, and told her everything. It was out of the question to have an abortion, because Keishla was already 27 years old, and she was ready to have a child, even if she had to raise it on her own. A few days later, Keishla broke the news to the father of her child, hoping in her heart that he would accept it. But Felix was not happy, to put it mildly. He got angry and told his mistress that she should go to the doctor, and if the pregnancy is confirmed, it will be necessary to have an abortion. Naturally, Rodriguez answered him with a firm refusal, but the boxer began to threaten her and insist. Felix said that an illegitimate child will finally destroy his reputation, and this he cannot allow. After Keishla's visit to the hospital, her pregnancy was confirmed, and she now had a certificate to prove it. She called Felix and told him everything, which made him furious. Felix shouted and demanded that Keishla immediately get rid of the child, but she again responded with a categorical refusal. Then the athlete decided to go on the sly, saying that he did not believe her and wanted to personally look at the issued medical certificate. He appointed Keishla a meeting in the evening in a crowded place, which did not surprise her, because they always tried not to draw attention to themselves and did not get in front of anyone. A few days before the meeting, the boxer stopped by his old friend Luis Antonio Pediz, who worked in a local machine shop and also had ties with the criminal world, selling illegal drugs. Felix briefly outlined the situation and asked him to help him get rid of his pregnant mistress. Luis had previously been in the field of vision of the police, and the prospect of being in prison scared him. But the athlete was persistent, assured that everything would go smoothly and the police will never come out on them. Besides, Felix promised him an impressive cash reward, and Luis agreed, with the support of an accomplice. Felix called Keishla and told her that he wanted to meet her on the evening of April 29th to confirm her pregnancy and decide what to do next. Immediately after talking to her lover, Keishla called her sister back and told her everything. She still had hope that Felix would accept her child and would not insist on an abortion. But Berylise, all this situation, is quite alarmed. She knew that the boyfriend had threatened her sister, and she was worried that he wouldn't do anything to her. Berylise called her mother and shared her concerns, but even together they could not dissuade Keishla from that fateful meeting. At the appointed time, Rodriguez, taking a doctor's note, arrived at the meeting in her own Kia Forte automobile. Verdejo drove there in his pickup truck, in the back of which Luis was hiding. Keishla immediately got into the athlete's car and showed him the results of the tests. He once again talked about terminating the pregnancy, but Keishla, crying, again responded with a refusal. Against this background, the couple began to quarrel violently, turning to shouting. Then Felix suddenly hit Keishla in the head with his fist, from which she immediately lost consciousness. Until Keishla regained consciousness, Felix took a syringe with a large dose of illegal substances hidden in the glove compartment of the car, which Luis had obtained at his request, and injected Keishla. Then, together with his accomplice, they carried her to the back of the car, where there were already prepared pieces of wire and a concrete block. The men tied Rodriguez up, attached the load, and then covered her with a tarp so that no one would accidentally see anything. Felix then returned to the pickup truck while his accomplice got behind the wheel of Keishla's vehicle. Together, they drove to the bridge over the San Jose Lagoon. It was virtually deserted at night, and the men, making sure no one could see them, threw Keishla, still alive, into the water. Afterward, however, they decided to fire a few test shots in pursuit, using the firearms they had brought with them so as not to leave the victim any chance. Having finished the massacre, each of the perpetrators went home. Keishla's co-workers were the first to worry when she didn't show up at the Veterinary Medicine and Aesthetics Center the next day. Keishla has always been very responsible and couldn't just not show up for work without notifying anyone. Since she didn't answer the phone, it was decided to contact her sister to find out what happened. After several unsuccessful attempts to contact her sister, she went to her house. No one answered the door, but Berenice had a spare key, so she got in without difficulty. However, she was met only by hungry animals who had not eaten anything for almost 24 hours. Now Berenice was already in a panic because she realized that something terrible or irreparable had happened to Keishla. She immediately called her mother and told her everything, and then reported to the police about her suspicions and threats to her sister. She also called Felix, but he claimed that he had spent the previous evening and night at home with his family and had not gone to any meeting. The missing girl's mother took the first flight from Florida to San Juan. She thought that her lover might have taken her daughter to a private clinic and paid for her to have an abortion without her consent. Kayla didn't even want to think about the fact that Keishla was no longer alive. The first thing to do was to question the missing girl's neighbors and co-workers, but they didn't notice anything suspicious and couldn't provide the investigation with any useful information. In parallel, messages about the disappearance of Rodriguez were posted on popular social networks with requests to respond to those who know anything about her fate or current whereabouts. The case quickly received wide publicity, and when it became known that the missing girl was in a long-term relationship with a famous athlete and was expecting a child from him, reporters literally lined up to interview any of Rodriguez's family members. The relatives did not hold anything back and spoke out about their suspicions, among other things, blaming Felix for the incident. On April 30th, Keishla's car was found abandoned on the east side of the city, with her documents and personal belongings inside. No signs of struggle were found in the interior, giving a faint hope of finding its owner alive. On May 1st, a passerby strolling on the bridge over the lagoon saw a strange shape resembling a human body in the shallow water. He reported his discovery to the police, who soon recovered from the water the body of a young woman, presumably the same one the whole city had been looking for several days. Members of the Rodriguez family, who arrived to identify the body, hoped to the last that it was not Keishla, but their hopes were not realized. The body had been in the water for several days and changed a lot. But the girl was immediately identified by a remarkable tattoo on her arm. When news of the gruesome discovery hit the press, the residents of the city revolted and began to go out to spontaneous rallies, demanding punishment for those responsible. The same day, Verdejo was detained and taken to the police station for questioning, but the athlete categorically denied his involvement and claimed that on the night of Keishla's disappearance, he was at home with his family. As there was nothing to charge him, Felix was released on his own recognizance. One of the key witnesses was the athlete's legal wife, who at the first interrogation admitted that she was aware of his affair with Keishla, but that she had heard about her rival's pregnancy for the first time. On top of that, she did not confirm her husband's alibi, saying that he was not at home on the night of the murder. The first thing investigators did was check traffic surveillance footage on the way to the bridge from which Keishla was thrown. That's how they found Felix's pickup truck and the victim's car traveling behind each other. But the Kia Forte was clearly not driven by its owner. On the same day, the boxer's car was seized for examination, and in its body they found some hair of the deceased. Luis was the first to surrender to the police, promising to tell the whole truth in exchange for a reduced sentence. Felix was also taken into custody, but he refused to cooperate with the investigation, did not answer questions, and continued to deny his guilt, despite the presence of irrefutable evidence. A firearm was seized from Felix, which he used to shoot the victim from the bridge, and for which he had an official permit. Also, a cell phone check confirmed the fact that Felix, Luis, and Keishla were in the same location on that fateful night. Keishla's final farewell was on May 8th, and the funeral ceremony was all over the national news. It was a kind of action, calling for the perpetrators of the tragedy to be punished to the full extent of the law, as well as an action to draw public attention to the problem of gender violence. The coffin with Rodriguez's body was brought to the cemetery, not in a traditional hearse, but in a white carriage, over which white flower petals were thrown from the air. Many famous Puerto Rican natives, including show business stars, athletes, politicians, and public figures, have spoken out about the high-profile incident. Verdejo was charged with carjacking, kidnapping, premeditated murder, and the murder of an unborn child. All of these crimes together carried the death penalty, but the relatives of the deceased from the very beginning asked the court to elect a sentence of life imprisonment for the killer, so that he would suffer in captivity for the rest of his life. The hearing was repeatedly postponed due to the worldwide coronavirus pandemic, but in the spring of 2021, the trial was held in virtual mode. The court found that the crime was committed by a group of persons by prior conspiracy and with particular cruelty against a pregnant woman. It was possible to reconstruct the chain of events of that night and the details of the crime, mainly thanks to the testimony of Luis, who did not deny his guilt. He admitted that it was he who, at the request of a friend, got the drug for injection and also brought a wire and a concrete block to get rid of the body. But Felix continued to insist on his non-involvement in the case, although his words could not seriously affect the situation. By the way, the wife of the boxer, who acted in court as a witness, almost immediately after the arrest of her husband filed for divorce and tried to abstract from what was happening, focusing on the development of his business and raising a young daughter. According to some reports, not so long ago, Elisa Santiago remarried. Elisa herself admitted in an interview that she repeatedly received anonymous calls and messages with death threats, as well as death wishes to her and even Miranda. Many considered it was the spouse of the athlete as the organizer of the crime, but no evidence was found. In the summer of 2023, it became known that the jury, having familiarized itself with all the evidence and heard the testimony of all the witnesses, was finally ready to announce the final verdict. Felix Verdejo and his accomplice Luis Cadiz were found guilty on each of the charges against them. But despite this, the killers have not yet been sentenced. The next court hearing is scheduled for mid-November 2023. Most likely, both men involved in the deaths of Keishla Rodriguez and her unborn child will likely go to prison for life, with no right to ever leave prison. In the summer of 2003, the body of 36-year-old Sabrina Payne was found in a field near Tremont, Illinois. Sabrina was a black female who was known to support a drug habit with prostitution. Sabrina had last been seen at her home 2 days before her body was found. The original autopsy failed to determine a cause of death, leaving some of the detectives to believe she overdosed. One detective, however, felt uneasy about that assumption. His suspicions were confirmed as more bodies were found in Peoria and Tazewell counties over the next year. On February 5, 2004, the body of 36-year-old Barbara Williams was found in a ditch near Edwards, Illinois. She was found partially clothed and lying face down in the snow. She had been seen alive between 9 and 10 p.m. the night before. An autopsy showed that she had multiple contusions and abrasions on her body. Toxicology showed that she had fatal levels of cocaine in her blood. At this point, police were not ready to call this a murder or entertain the idea of a serial killer preying on black drug-addicted prostitutes. In October of 2004, 32-year-old Shakanda Thomas was reported missing. She had last been seen by her family in August. Shakanda was known to disappear at times, but when she didn't come back after several weeks, her family reported her missing. Shirley Ann Trapp was also reported missing in the late summer of 2004. She was seen 3 days before she was reported missing. Tamara Walsh was reported missing in September of 2004 after not being seen for 3 weeks. All 3 missing women were also black females known to support a crack cocaine habit with prostitution. 36-year-old mother of 8, Laura Lawler, disappeared from her home after leaving with a man and woman. Her longtime partner searched for her but only was able to determine she had been with a man named Larry. Her boyfriend, and father to her 7 daughters and 1 son, describes Laura as the love of his life and a beautiful soul. The two had experimented with crack cocaine, and Laura seemed to struggle with addiction before her disappearance. On September 25, 2004, Linda Neal was found on King Road in Tazewell County. She was found nude along the side of the road. Linda, like the other women, was known to be part of the drug scene in Peoria. At this point, police had determined there was likely a serial killer stalking black females in the Peoria area. A task force was formed, which one detective states would have occurred much quicker if the victims had been white females. While police desperately searched for the killer, they kept a close eye on women in the community at risk. Despite their efforts, on October 15, 2004, Brenda Irving's body was found in a ditch near Farmington. Brenda was found nude, and an autopsy determined that she had been strangled and suffered blunt force trauma to her head. She also had fatal levels of cocaine in her system at the time of her death. Her children had feared for their mother's safety, as she had known many of the women who had been killed or disappeared from central Illinois. Brenda struggled with drug addiction. Despite detectives' best efforts, the case proved difficult to solve. They followed thousands of leads, but finally got the lead they were waiting for in December of 2004. 35-year-old Vicki Bomer was arrested for theft. From jail, she told authorities that she thought she could help them find the serial killer preying on her fellow sex workers. She believed that a man who had picked her up in July 2004 was responsible. Bomer explained that in July, a man named Larry Bright lured her to his mother's home where they shared alcohol and drugs. Once she was intoxicated, she said Bright attacked her, attempted to rape her, and pulled a knife on her. Somehow, Bomer was able to escape. Police were at first skeptical, as Bomer asked for a plea deal in exchange for her testimony. Why hadn't she reported this back in July? Why wait until she was under arrest? Vicki Bomer claimed she was scared of being arrested for outstanding warrants, which is why she did not come forward in July 2004. A search of her criminal history confirmed the warrants, so detectives decided to take a look at the man named Larry Bright. Larry Dean Bright was born in Peoria, Illinois, on July 8, 1966. He served a 2-year stint in prison at age 19 for burglary and carjacking. According to Larry's family, the time Larry spent in prison changed him for the worse. Larry became more angry and violent and began using drugs. Larry had an injury, which started an addiction to prescription opioids and later crack cocaine. He also developed an addiction to pornography, preferring videos with black women. Larry lived with his mother in a tiny guest house behind her home. Larry enjoyed gardening, creating a beautiful garden bed of flowers for his mother. When the police arrived at Larry's home following the tip, they noticed the beautiful flowers in the garden. Larry was placed under arrest for the unlawful restraint of Vicki. They questioned Larry about the murders, but he denied having any information about the murdered and missing women. Throughout the interview, Larry smoked several cigarettes. Detectives planned to take one of the cigarette butts and test it for DNA, but Larry ate them before leaving the interrogation room. Larry declined to give DNA voluntarily. Police searched Larry Bright's home on January 20, 2005. The investigators dug up the garden, finding several small bone fragments and ashes that were later determined to be human. When the police questioned Larry again, they told him they were digging up his mother's flowers. At this point, Larry broke down and confessed to multiple murders. He even led investigators to the remains of some of his victims. Larry explained that around July 27, 2003, he picked up Sabrina Payne on the south side of Peoria. He drove her to his home, which he shared with his mother. He claimed the two drank and used cocaine before having consensual sex. Larry said he did not intend to kill Sabrina, but he became enraged, thinking Sabrina was trying to rip him off. He strangled her to death and dumped her body near the cornfield where she was found. Larry confessed to picking up Barbara Williams in February 2004. Again, he used drugs and alcohol with his victim. He stated that he once again lost control of his anger and killed Barbara. He claimed he caught Barbara stealing from him. He dumped her body along the road, where she was found the next day. The prosecution believed that after the first two murders, Larry developed a bloodlust. At the time of his arrest, he said, "I knew them I would kill the others I would pick up. I went out hunting." Larry also confessed to killing Laura Lauer. He burned her body in his backyard burn pit, burying the remains in his mother's yard. He said he wanted to destroy the bodies to avoid getting caught. He confessed to killing Tamara Walls and burning her remains. Her jawbone was found in the backyard. He admitted to strangling, beating, and burning Shirley and Trapp. Shakonda Thomas had the same fate after being picked up by Larry Bright. He burned the woman and buried the ashes in the yard. Because of his attempts to cremate his victims, he was nicknamed the Bone Crusher. Larry said that he attempted to burn Linda Neal and Brenna Irving as well, but the attempts were unsuccessful due to the weather. He dumped both women along the side of the road. Larry was facing the death penalty following his January 2005 arrest. In an attempt to spare his mother the embarrassment of a trial and avoid the death penalty, Larry Bright pleaded guilty to 7 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of drug-induced homicide on May 30, 2006. Bright's murders were not considered racially motivated, but detectives believe he was just attracted to black women. He is one of the very few serial killers who chooses victims outside of his race. Larry was sentenced to 7 life sentences without the possibility of parole, to be served concurrently. He was also given an additional 30 years for the drug-induced homicide. As part of the plea deal, Larry will be required to serve 100% of his sentence with no parole consideration. Larry is currently housed at the Shawnee Correctional Center in Vienna, Illinois. He will spend the rest of his life behind bars, but that brings little peace to the families of his victims. The loved ones of Larry's victims want people to know that the women he killed were more than just drug addicts or prostitutes. They were people. They were mothers, daughters, sisters, and friends. The serial killer dentist of St. Louis, Glennon Engelman. Dr. Glennon Engelman was born on February 6, 1927, in St. Louis, Missouri. Dr. Engelman grew up on the south side of the city and felt a deep connection to his neighborhood. After serving in the military, Dr. Engelman used his GI Bill to go to Washington University and become a dentist. He opened his dental office on the south side of St. Louis, serving the community he had always loved. Dr. Engelman, who went by Glenn, was married to a woman named Edna Ruth, but they divorced in 1956. By 1958, both Glenn and Ruth had remarried. Glenn was operating his dental office and appeared to be successfully serving the St. Louis community. On December 17, 1958, citizens in Forest Park noticed a bloody man stumbling. The man, James Stanley Bullock, soon passed from his injuries. These injuries were caused by a gunshot. No one could figure out why someone would shoot 28-year-old James Bullock. James Bullock was born on April 17, 1931, in DeSoto. He was raised in Shiloh, Illinois, by his grandparents and later his aunt after his parents passed away. According to an article from 1938, the then 7-year-old was living with his grandparents in 1938 and enjoyed attending school and fishing. James later served in the military before returning to St. Louis to work and go to college. Back in St. Louis, James met Edna Ruth, the ex-wife of Dr. Glenn Engelman. The two married, and 6 short months later, James was dead. An employee at a local sanitarium initially claimed James was there 4 days before his murder, asking to be admitted because he feared for his life. His wife and aunt said this was not true, as the three had dinner together on that night. According to his widow and aunt, James was not afraid for his life, and they knew no one who would want him dead. However, Edna Ruth benefited greatly from her husband's death. Ruth had life insurance policies totaling $64,088. While under questioning, Edna Ruth made several weird statements, including telling the police she was married before, but her husband did not know. Who was she married to? Her husband's dentist, Dr. Glenn Engelman. Edna Ruth had lied to James and his family and lied on the marriage application about being married before. Police questioned a local career criminal who was out on parole for an assault at the time of the shooting. They weren't able to tie him to the murder of James, but they did note he lived near Dr. Engelman's office. Dr. Engelman and Edna Ruth both refused to take a polygraph test and denied any involvement in the murder of James Bullock. Dr. Engelman's new wife, Ida, refused to be questioned by the police. A patient provided an alibi for Dr. Engelman. However, another witness said that they tried to find someone at the office around the time and the office was empty. Edna Ruth invested part of the funds she received after becoming a widow into doctor. Been bored being a dentist, so he often ventured into other areas of business. This included buying a trike strip along with a partner, Eric Fry. Dr. Engelman had grown to be close friends with Eric and his wife Sandy. On September 26, 1963, Eric and Dr. Engelman were at the trike strip using dynamite to explode and then fill abandoned cisterns on the property. Eric was lying on his stomach near one of the cisterns when the dynamite exploded quicker than anticipated. Eric was killed instantly and found lying in the bottom of the cistern. Coroner H.D. Steinbeck ruled the death accidental. Mr. Frey's wife had an insurance policy on her husband, which she invested part of into Dr. Engelman's practice. Dr. Engelman divorced Ida and married his third wife, Ruth, in 1967. The couple shared a son, but Ruth hated the close relationship her husband had with a young woman who worked in his office named Carmen Miranda. Dr. Engelman offered to train Carmen to be a dental assistant in his office. Edna felt uncomfortable with the flirting between the doctor and his young assistant. Dr. Engelman, however, claimed he was trying to help people in his community. He hired Carmen's brother, Nick, as well at one point. Ruth was relieved when Carmen met a married man named Peter Holm. Just a few months later, however, Carmen and Eric were walking in a rural area in Pacific, Missouri. The couple were exploring an area known to have caves and scenic paths. A shot suddenly fired, hitting Peter in the head. Peter died instantly, and a hysterically Carmen flagged down the help. Nearby, police found an X on a tree made with tape. The area was familiar to locals as a hunting area, and police believed that the shot was accidental. Police believe someone was target shooting at the axe and accidentally struck Mr. Holm. Carmen had a significant amount of life insurance on her husband, totaling $60,000. This is equivalent to around $300,000 in 2024. Dr. Engelman and Ruth divorced soon after, at which time Dr. Engelman married young Carmen, whom he had known since she was a small child. His son lived with Edna, his ex-wife. Despite being married to Carmen, Dr. Engelman and Ruth still met regularly for sex. Dr. Engelman constantly had extramarital affairs, which included previous affairs with Carmen, Ruth, and even Sandy Fry, the wife of his business associate Eric Fry, who was killed by dynamite. Another of Dr. Engelman's affairs was with a patient named Barbara Boyle. On November 3, 1977, someone pretending to be from the farm girl walked up to the farmhouse owned by Arthur and Vernita Guswell in Everettsville, Illinois. Soon after entering the home, the elderly couple were attacked and both were shot in the head. The wealthy couple left $340,000 to their son, Ronald Guswell. Guess who Ronald Guswell was married to? Barbara Boyle. On April 4, 1979, less than 2 years after the murder of his parents, Ronald Guswell was found dead inside his car outside a hotel in East St. Louis, Illinois. The man had been beaten and shot to death. He had been missing for 4 days when his body was found. Following her husband's murder, Barbara collected his inheritance in addition to several life insurance policies. The equivalent sum of money today would be nearly $1.7 million. Guess who she cut to? Dr. Glenn Engelman. Following the murder of Ronald Guswell, authorities were starting to notice the trend of connected deaths to Dr. Engelman. His patients and community, however, only saw a generous man committed to helping his community and its citizens. Dr. Engelman was not the greatest dentist, however. He often did a sloppy job of making casts for dentures and dental appliances, requiring the work to have to be redone by the dental lab several times. His business was struggling, however, and he soon found himself in debt with the dental lab owned by Sophie Barrera. Sophie Barrera owned a South St. Louis dental laboratory and had grown tired of waiting for Dr. Engelman to pay up by 1980. She filed a lawsuit against the doctor that was set to go to court just a few days after Sophie was murdered. On January 14, 1980, Sophie entered her vehicle in South St. Louis. Shortly after, the vehicle exploded. Police found remnants of a bomb under her charred vehicle. Sophie had told her son before she was in fear of being killed. She believed Dr. Glenn Engelman was dangerous. Dr. Engelman was questioned for 3 hours and then released. Police were certain he was responsible for Sophie's death, but they had to prove it. The public also wondered if the bombing was related to another bombing in the area that was carried out between two mob families fighting for control over St. Louis's labor unions. The evidence indicated, however, that this was not a mob hit. The number one suspect was the man who owed Sophie $15,000. Dr. Engelman had to be stopped, but the police weren't sure how to do it. Detectives soon began having conversations with Dr. Engelman's ex-wife and mother of his son, Ruth. Ruth told police nothing at first, but eventually started to talk. She explained that Dr. Engelman often bragged about killing people. He told her that he had a superpower. He was able to kill without remorse. He had admitted to killing Eric Fry, Peter Holm, and the Guswell family. It was his side hustle, killing for profit. Ruth agreed to help the police, but none of her testimony could be used in court because Dr. Engelman confessed to her while the two were still married. He was protected by spousal privilege. Ruth decided to wear a wire, however, and met up with Dr. Engelman to exchange their son and sometimes just to socialize. They were still having a sexual relationship despite Dr. Engelman's marriage to Carmen. She tried to get Dr. Engelman to confess to her again by asking direct questions. He didn't seem to take the bait at first, and Ruth feared he would kill her next. Ruth suggested police plant a bug in her bedroom and she would invite the dentist over for sex. Dr. Engelman was suspicious, however, and did not say anything that could lead to his arrest. Ruth then met him at a diner wearing a wire, and this time he commented on being homicidally intimate with the widow of one of his victims. He admitted to the murders in great detail, providing just what police needed for an arrest. He explained that he found murder more sexually satisfying than sex. His ex-wife was given a new life in the witness protection program. Carmen, who was no longer married to the dentist, and her brother Nick were brought in for questioning to corroborate the allegations against Dr. Engelman. As possible co-conspirators, they asked for and were granted immunity to testify against the dentist. Carmen told quite the story. She said she was working for the dentist when he suggested she find someone with good benefits to marry. He told her about Eric Fry, whom he said he directed Sandy Fry to marry with all intentions of murdering the insurance proceeds. Soon after she was married, Carmen said Dr. Engelman told her where to go and made sure her husband was shot and killed. He staged it to look like a target shooting accident. Glenn Engelman was finally arrested and charged with murder in 1980. Carmen testified at Dr. Engelman's first trial, for which he was convicted of murdering Peter Holm and given 50 years in prison. The dentist then pled guilty to the murder of Sophie Barrera to avoid the death penalty. Serving a life sentence for that murder in Missouri, Dr. Engelman was back in court by 1985 in Illinois. In 1984, Robert Handy, a convict and acquaintance of Dr. Engelman, admitted to authorities that he had taken part in the murder conspiracy of the Guswell family. He implicated Dr. Engelman, who had bludgeoned Ronald Guswell and shot him, as well as Ronald's widow, Barbara Boyle. Dr. Engelman was given 3 life sentences for the Guswell murders. He also was convicted of federal mail fraud and given a 30-year federal sentence. He is believed to have killed at least 12 people, including conspiring with his first wife to kill her husband, James Bullock, in 1958. Edna Ruth was never charged in the case due to lack of evidence. Barbara Boyle went on trial for the murder of her in-laws, Arthur and Vernita Guswell, and husband Ronald in 1985. The jury acquitted her of the murders of Arthur and Vernita but convicted her of conspiracy to commit murder in the death of Ronald Guswell. Barbara Boyle was sentenced to 50 years in prison in 1985. She was granted parole in 2009. Dr. Engelman enjoyed his notoriety in Missouri, often comparing himself to legendary outlaw Jesse James. He is believed to have killed at least 12 people, but the actual number is unknown. Unlike other serial killers, Dr. Engelman was inspired, at least in part, by greed. He also seemed to revel in his ability to not feel remorse. Dr. Engelman died of diabetes-related health issues in 1999 at age 72. He was incarcerated in Jefferson City at the time. Sadistic serial killer Michael Madison. 2 weeks shy of Halloween, 1977, Michael Madison was born on October 15th in Cleveland, Ohio. His parents, Diane Madison and John Baldwin, accidentally got pregnant and didn't have much of a relationship at the time of his birth. John Baldwin left Diane to care for their young son and denied being Michael's father. Growing up, Diane's mother had been a sex worker and heroin addict. She grew up in a household full of neglect. Diane's upbringing left her unprepared to care for her young son independently. Shortly after giving birth to her son, Michael, social workers were brought into the home. Diane was allowing her constant stream of boyfriends to punish Michael. When Michael was 2, Diane was found to have forcefully stuffed food down Michael's throat. As a result, the toddler began vomiting uncontrollably. Unsure of what to do, Diane put her screaming son into a tub full of hot water. This caused Michael to cry more. Growing frustrated with her young son, Diane took him out of the bath and beat him with an extension cord. A year later, one of Diane's many boyfriends beat Michael so severely with a belt that the young boy vomited and needed to be hospitalized. In another horrific incident, Michael was beaten so severely by another one of Diane's boyfriends that he lost hearing in one of his ears. After years of abuse, Michael was sent to live with his grandmother, who was still a heroin addict and sex worker. But unfortunately, Michael's horrific childhood wouldn't change. Michael continued to be hospitalized for reasons such as dehydration. The social workers involved in Michael's case would note that he and his half-brother were covered in scratches and bruises. Before Michael reached high school, he had become a familiar face to law enforcement. On several occasions, the teenager had been found using lemon. In high school, he received a delinquent charge for inappropriately touching another classmate. The crimes Michael committed as a teenager were nothing like the ones he would go on to commit as an adult. In July 2013, the family of 38-year-old Angela Deskins reported her missing after they hadn't heard from her since June. Deskins was known for disappearing from time to time, so the family didn't think much of it. A month after she went missing, her body was discovered wrapped in electrical cords with a belt around her neck. 28-year-old Shadisha Sheely was reported missing in September 2012 when she didn't show up at her mother's house. Sheely, along with her 12-year-old daughter, were living with extended family at the time, and Sheely was supposed to stop by her mother's house to borrow some money, but she never showed. Her body was found in July 2013 inside a plastic garbage bag. After returning home from her job at an elementary school, 18-year-old Sherelda Terry disappeared. Her body was also found inside a black trash bag. On July 19, 2013, Michael's neighbors called the police to report a horrible smell coming from a garage near his second-floor apartment building. Inside the garage, the police discovered the decomposing body of a woman. During the police search of the surrounding area, including other vacant homes and backyards, the police found the bodies of 2 more women. Each was wrapped in plastic bags and located approximately 200 yards apart. The police were granted a search warrant for Michael's home, and inside they found further evidence of decomposition. Now the search was on to find where Michael Madison was. The police tracked him down to his mother's house. When they arrived, Michael refused to come out, resulting in a several-hour-long standoff between him and the police before he finally agreed to come out and was taken into police custody. Michael never once showed remorse to the victims' families during the trial. Michael laughed, smiled, and taunted the families. During Sherelda Terry's father's victim impact statement, Michael smiled at the distraught father. This set Terry's father off, and he tried to attack Michael but was quickly stopped. Michael didn't stop smiling once during the altercation. The jury deliberated less than a day before Michael Madison was found guilty of all 3 murders. He was also found guilty of 3 counts of kidnapping, 3 counts of gross abuse of a corpse, 1 count of rape, and 1 count of weapons possession by an ex-convict. On May 20th, 2016, Michael was sentenced to death, a sentence he would attempt to appeal a month later. On July 21st, 2020, the Ohio Supreme Court voted unanimously to uphold the death sentence for Michael Madison. Killer Ronald O'Brien. Children are cautioned from an early age not to accept candy from strangers. While this golden rule is strictly enforced by vigilant parents throughout the year, on Halloween night, they throw caution to the wind and allow their little ones to go door to door asking for treats. In most instances, their request is granted without worry. Even so, once in a while, the monsters that lurk in the shadows take advantage of the occasion, resulting in dire consequences for the most innocent among us. In 1974, a boy in Pasadena, Texas fell victim to just such a predator when he became violently ill after indulging in a treat from his Halloween bag. Ever the concerned parent, his father had stayed by his side during the hour-long ordeal, offering comfort to the youngster as he convulsed on the bathroom floor. Only 8 years old at the time, Timothy O'Brien died later that night on his way to the hospital. In a shocking turn of events, an autopsy revealed that he had ingested enough potassium cyanide to kill 2 grown men. As difficult as it was to believe, all signs pointed to the fact that someone had deliberately laced candy with the colorless compound before randomly handing it out to unsuspecting children. Investigators were convinced that a cold-blooded killer was hiding somewhere in the suburbs of Houston, and they intended to find him. With no suspects in mind and little evidence to go on, detectives theorized that an unscrupulous person who was angry at the world in general had decided to take the life of a complete stranger, a child no less, as a way of getting back at society. To make a difficult situation even worse, there was no telling how many children had received the tainted sweets. Although authorities had put out an emergency news bulletin requesting that all Halloween candy be brought to the police station for inspection, they feared that there would be other victims before all was said and done. While they faced an uphill battle, to be sure, investigators did have a few things working in their favor. For one, it had been raining heavily on the evening of Trick or Treat, which had limited the number of houses that Timothy and his sister Elizabeth had visited. More importantly, a chemical analysis of the contents of the boys' treat bag had enabled them to pinpoint the carrier of the poison. Lab tests revealed that the killer's lethal weapon of choice had been the sweet and sour powder contained inside of a straw-shaped pixie sticks. After meeting with the residents of the houses where the O'Brien children were known to have gotten candy, detectives were confident that none of them had given up pixie sticks. However, during the course of their interviews, they learned that someone had been witnessed doling out that particular treat and that someone had been Timothy's father, Ronald O'Brien. When he was brought in for questioning, O'Brien claimed that a man he had never seen before had emerged from a darkened home and given him several pixie sticks to hand out on his behalf. He added that, after consuming a small amount of the sugary powder, Timothy had complained that it tasted funny. Instead of telling him to throw it out, he had given his son a soft drink to help wash it down. Under the pretense of helping police solve the case, he had readily provided them with the address of the house where the exchange had taken place. Upon speaking with the mystery man, who turned out to be an air traffic controller named Courtney Melvin, officers learned that he had an alibi for the night in question. According to him, he had been at work and had not returned home until well after midnight. When they visited his place of employment, his supervisor confirmed his story and had the paperwork to prove it. In a stunning show of support, 200 of Melvin's coworkers came forward to vouch for his character. Realizing that they had been duped, investigators quickly concluded that this man was not their killer, something that Ronald O'Brien had known all along. A bit of digging into his past uncovered that Ronald O'Brien, who had trained as an optician, was not nearly as respectable as he wanted others to believe. I'm not content who couldn't hold a job, he was drowning in a sea of debt. Not above taking what he wanted, he had been accused of stealing on numerous occasions, usually by former employers. While being shiftless and prone to theft doesn't necessarily mean that someone is capable of murder, the fact that O'Brien had taken out hefty life insurance policies, not 1 but 3, on his children in the months prior to his son's untimely death moved him to the top of the list of suspects. Another nail in O'Brien's self-constructed coffin came when it was discovered that he had phoned the insurance company on the morning after his son's death, inquiring about a payout. As the 8-year-old's body lay in the icy morgue, his father's only concern had been how quickly the money he had coming would change hands. On November 5, 1974, less than a week after Timothy was poisoned, Ronald O'Brien was taken into custody and formally charged with 1 count of murder and 4 counts of attempted murder. To no one's surprise, he pleaded not guilty across the board. He would steadfastly maintain his innocence throughout the trial, despite the damning evidence against him. During the proceedings, a parade of witnesses testified that O'Brien had become fixated on the properties of cyanide in the months leading up to his son's murder. His obsession led him to brazenly ask friends and family alike if they knew where he could purchase the deadly poison. He would also inquire of them if they had any idea how much of the substance it would take to kill a person. In June of 1975, 8 months after little Timothy O'Brien had been laid to rest, his father was convicted of his murder. He was also found guilty in the attempted poisonings of the other 4 children, none of whom had ingested the lethal powder. For his crimes, Ronald O'Brien, whom the press had dubbed the Candyman, was condemned to the electric chair. Down the road, as alternative methods of execution were introduced, his punishment was amended to a more humane death by lethal injection. It had taken the jury just over an hour to decide the fate of the man who had so callously plotted and carry out the murder of someone who had trusted him implicitly. Once the verdict was in, the waiting game began. As it happened, 9 years would pass, more time than Timothy had spent on this earth before his killer would face final justice. During his time on death row, O'Brien was reviled by his fellow inmates who, despite their own misdeeds, considered him to be lower than a snake's belly. Their hatred of the child killer ran so deep that they had thrown a party on the day of his demise to let him know that he would not be missed. After several days of execution, O'Brien was put to death on March 31, 1984, at the age of 39. When asked if he had any last words, he had taken the opportunity to rail against the system that had allowed him to come to such an end. When his death was announced over the loudspeaker, hundreds of people who had gathered outside the prison to celebrate the occasion had shouted trick or treat while throwing handfuls of candy in the air in remembrance of Timothy, a young boy who had paid the ultimate price for his father's greed. Todd Allen Reed, the Forest Park killer. The bodies of 3 women were found in the same stretch of parkland, all within a month of each other. It was not long before police had their man. But is he responsible for more than the 3 murders they convicted him for? 32-year-old Todd Allen Reed was already a registered sex offender when he strangled to death at least 3 women before dunking their naked bodies in Forest Park, a heavily wooded area just west of Portland, Oregon. From 1992 to 1995, he had served a measly 2.5 years of a 12-year sentence for the sexual assault of Shelley Harding, who was 7 months pregnant at the time of his cowardly attack. She had been walking home from work when he approached her and forced her into his car at knife point. Reed was involved in him and fled the scene of a minor crash with another vehicle on his way to the secluded spot where he sexually assaulted Shelley. After he had assaulted her, he attempted to strangle her with a seatbelt and began to cry. Shelley was strong and she was calm. She had been talking to Reed constantly, like he was a friend almost, building a rapport. Whilst doing so, she made sure to leave as much physical evidence as she could, touching every surface to leave as many of her prints as possible. Whatever this monster was going to do to her, she wasn't going to make it easy for him to get away with. When Reed broke down, she used this to her advantage, and her pleas to be let go and her promises that she would not tell anyone worked. Reed let her go. Not only did Shelley report her abduction and assault, the 2 men that had been in the car that Reed had crashed into also reported the hit and run. They even had his license plate. Reed pleaded no contest and was handed the 12-year sentence. He was registered as a sex offender and, crucially, his DNA was taken and stored in the state crime lab. This would be the golden ticket police needed to catch the Forest Park serial killer 7 years later. Reed was released early as he had built up sentence-reducing credits, half of which were for good behavior. At roughly 8 miles long and 5,100 acres, Forest Park is one of the largest urban forest reserves in the USA, ranked 19th to be more precise. It is not easy to wander from the 70 miles of trails due to the park's dense vegetation. To highlight just how secluded this park can get once you're off trail, in 2004, a 53-year-old man called Frank and his 12-year-old daughter Ruth were discovered to be living off-grid in the park. They had been there for 4 years, completely undetected. On May 7, 1999, a couple walking their dog on one of the park's more remote trails would come across the body of 28-year-old Wella Faye Mahler. She was naked and face down, entangled in thick blackberry brambles. She had been strangled, and it was determined that her body had been there for around 2 months. Police would find a used condom merely 28 feet from her body. They were able to extract DNA from this vital piece of evidence. The next day, May 8th, police themselves would discover a second body whilst they were searching the immediate area. The body of 26-year-old Stephanie Lynn Muscle was found around a quarter of a mile away from where Lilla had been discovered. She too was found naked and had been strangled. Tests would determine she had been left there less than a week before she was found. They would also recover traces of DNA on her thighs. A group of hikers would find the third body, that of 18-year-old Alexandria Eisen, in the early evening of June 2nd. Alexandria had been reported missing sometime in May. Police were unable to reach her body until the next day. Due to the location, she'd been dumped down an extremely steep slope just off of a deer path. She was found naked, and she too had been strangled. Her body was around 1/4 of a mile away from Lilla and Stephanie's. After the discovery of Alexandria's body, Police Chief Charles Moves admitted that investigators had concluded they were looking for a serial killer due to the similarities of the crimes. Physically, all 3 women resembled each other, but they also had very similar life experiences. They were all homeless at the time of their deaths and had cocaine and heroin addictions, although Stephanie had just completed a detox program before her murder. Lilla and Alexandria had been at some point engaged in prostitution to pay for these addictions. All 3 women were known to frequent West Burnside Street. It's also been claimed that Lilla and Stephanie knew each other, although this has not been proven either way. It was determined that all 3 of the women had been murdered elsewhere and their bodies were taken to Forest Park afterwards. Toxicology all showed that they had taken heroin sometime before their deaths. The police response was immediate and it was impressive. A specialist task force consisting of 16 individuals was formed, and they set about scouting bars, reaching out and offering protection to the community being targeted, and 30 additional beds were made available for homeless women during the investigation. Although residents were not happy about the lack of information they were receiving, the police kept their investigation tightly under wraps. Such was their determination to catch this killer. The task force would use the physical similarities of the 3 women to their advantage. A female officer of a similar appearance posed as a prostitute on West Burnside Street to see if they could reel the killer in. And sure enough, Reed took the bait. On the July 7th, the same day a vigil was being held for Lilla, Stephanie, and Alexandria, Reed approached the undercover officer, and it was not long before his suspicious behavior flagged him to police. At about 5:20 a.m., he was approached by a member of the lookout team, Sergeant John Botchlet. Reed readily admitted that he was a sex offender and agreed to a search of his vehicle. They found an unused condom, a book entitled The Killing Gift, about a woman who can kill men by merely looking at them, and some yellow strapping. There was nothing incriminating to be found, and the police had to let him go. He was not off the hook, however, far from it. Another lookout that night, Detective Sergeant Dave Schlegel, recognized him from the 1992 sexual assault case. He had in fact been the arresting officer. Police began 24-hour surveillance of Reed, both at his home and at his place of work. At least once during this surveillance, he was observed driving in circles around West Burnside and Sandy Boulevard. The police swab results came back and confirmed that the DNA from the condom at the Moore crime scene and the DNA found on Stephanie's thighs matched the DNA that was on file for Todd Allen Reed. At around 7:30 p.m. on July 18th, after Reed had left for work, police executed a search warrant at his address, where he lived with his girlfriend. Once the police had left the premises, his girlfriend phoned him to let him know the police had been there. He attempted to make a getaway in the middle of his shift, but it was too late. The police had already arrived. At 11:30 p.m. on July 18th, 11 days after police had questioned him and only 1.5 months after the task force was set up, Reed was arrested outside of Ranella Produce, the warehouse where he worked night shifts, unloading the delivery trucks. On July 27th, he was indicted on 7 criminal counts in relation to 3 homicides. It emerged that Reed, who had been ordered to serve 8 years post-prison supervision and actually been kicked out of a sex offender treatment program 2 weeks before his arrest for failure to attend. On February 23, 2001, he pleaded guilty and received 3 consecutive life sentences with no possibility of parole. Reed had been facing the death penalty, but his plea deal took this off of the table. Reed is also the prime suspect in 2, possibly 3, other murders in the Portland area. The cases being referred to by Reed are the 1987 cold case murders of 15-year-old Jennifer Lyncher and 12-year-old Mindy Colleen Thomas, and the 1999 disappearance of 19-year-old Alma Vecines. In regards to the murders, Gresham Police Sergeant David Lerwick has been quoted as saying, "Always suspect that he was the person who killed both those girls. We didn't have enough evidence to convict him." Jennifer had gone missing on July 3, 1987, and her skeletal remains was found on July 8, 1988. Mingy went missing from the apartment complex where she lived on August 3, 1987, and her body was discovered on October 4, 1988. Both of the children had been strangled and dumped in wooded areas on the eastern side of Gresham, about 3 miles apart, and they were both last seen in the company of Gail Bennett, Reed's then-girlfriend and later wife. They married in 1988 and divorced in 1997. Gresham police said Bennett, who has a police record of her own, might have information about the killings but has been uncooperative. Bennett has denied any knowledge. At the time, police were operating under the assumption that they had both been killed by the same man, and that this man was known to them. They had questioned Reed at the time of the investigation due to the fact they had both been seen with Gail, but he was never charged or arrested. Police renewed efforts to solve the Gresham cases after his arrest in the Portland killings, but attempts to compare DNA from the old crimes with Reed's DNA have been inconclusive. Alma the witness seen on June 30, 1999, and has not been seen since. She was working as a prostitute at the time of her disappearance, and it has been claimed she knew/was friends with Alexandria Eisen. No charges have been brought forward in her case, although it is impossible to downplay the likelihood they already had something to do with Ametha's disappearance. As of June 2020, what prison Reed is in is not known, and as of June 2021, he was no longer listed as an inmate and may be dead.